on the list, but it's just the first one that is active.
Okay, so we're at 1:15, so I think we can start with the next session. It's my pleasure to introduce François Galgani from Infirmer France and Alexander Tura from Universidade de São Paulo, Brazil, both serving as co-chairs of the CASAMP Working Group 40. And I'm very excited to this session, which is going to be about towards standard sampling protocols, but I'm going to let François and Alex explain the scope and the plan themselves. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Arthur. Welcome all. Good afternoon or good morning. I'm really happy to be with you today. What I will do is just quickly introduce the session. Maybe Alex will give more information about the way we have organized it and the way we will manage all the questions and so on. And then Alex will present some slides on the different indicators, and I will come back on the constraints, best practices, and some examples on best practices and the different step forward. So maybe Alex, you would like to say something about the session?
Yes. Thank you, Francois. Good morning, all. Good afternoon, all. Good night, all. We are here to have a nice discussion on harmonizing, how to harmonize or standardize sampling protocols. And the idea is to set the scene in the beginning and then open the floor for contributions from you in a way on how to improve that. This will be done using CMAP tools, mind map software, so that we will be all at the same page, focusing on what were the contributions of the participants, so that we will make it more objective and streamlined. So I think we will have the opportunity to do that after the break in the second part of the session. And it's Francois, I think it's all.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So the idea is to have a short presentation that will take just some minutes for me. And the session is very long this afternoon, and it's open for long discussion, in-depth discussion, I would say. And it's quite important that you feel really free of asking and managing, commenting, and so on, all the different topics we will address. At the end, the objective is to have some recommendation dedicated to the indicators, harmonization, best practices, and so on, that we may, I would say, update during the week. And so that, it will be included in the final conclusion then later. So quickly, the story of global monitoring, to my knowledge, it was first proposed by the G7 in 2015. It was under the presidency of Germany, and some of you were present in these meetings at the beginning. And the idea was to have a global platform for monitoring and linking directly with the UNEP and UNEP regional C conventions. And so it's quite important, because sometimes what is come from G7 is perceived as something very global and just ideas and so on. But in fact, step by step, first the G20 also launched its G20 platform with some consideration for monitoring. And then G7 in 27 Italy, said that it was really important to have regional C conventions involved. It was also confirmed in 2019 by France in the ministerial meeting. And then UNEA in 2019 also gave some information in the recommendation to have some global monitoring, and with some question about governance, technical support, and so on. And then we have another initiative that is more recent, and I will give some basic information. The next framework program for research in Europe is named Horizon Europe. And for the program itself, it will fund a lot of research, but there are also some dedicated missions to specific topics, and there will be one on ocean with a substantial amount of support funding. And this mission will include largely, projects on plastics, and we start already discussing, how to support the global monitoring of more litter. And there is actually an agreement. We don't know how to do that. That will come probably next year and so on. But it's I mean, important to know that Europe will be interested in participating in such a project. So beside the governance, we do have different initiatives that were launched on scientific and technical aspects. G7 also in January 2016 discussed in Japan the different indicators. They were more or less related to those that are stated in the ocean governance for now. Then there was a dedicated session also at the International Marine Debris Conference in San Diego. Also the meetings held by IEEOS in 2018-19. Then Oceanops meeting with the AMDOS paper. There was a lot of co-authors, GeoBlue Planet Initiative and the link with Ocean Decade. Also the report from GESAMP, the white paper, UNEP related from Emily and the co-authors. And then this meeting that will bring probably more operational insight, I would say. So this is globally the story. It may be not exactly, this is how I felt it. And so I think it's, we are now, as said Sanay in the previous session, we are not ready to go for more operational work. So there are different initiatives, global platforms, such as the Regional Sea Convention that are linked together with the potential for beach litter monitoring and some database already organized at the regional sea level, like ODIPS and Enforac for Barcelona Convention and so on. Or these large-scale platforms like Geostyles, but I don't know whether they could be already operational or just, potentially able to manage, global monitoring of litter. Then we have some regional non-UN platforms like ISIS, International Council for Exploration of the Sea. It's mainly for the Northeast Atlantic. We launched some databases that are used by EMONET. MSLD in Europe also launched monitoring. It was some years ago and it's now operational. And it has also EMONET database. We have national platforms that are very efficient. Australia, Brazil has one. Maybe we'll have some more information later with Alex. China has one, US NOAA has one. Many countries have started on monitoring already. Then we have global approach from large NGOs like Coastal Cleanup, for instance, AWARE. And then we have initiatives from a scientific institution like the one from JASTEC on seafloor, which to my opinion is very interesting in terms of global monitoring. Okay, so the problem is that we have, where the human intelligence is, looking for a different way to count all the plastic, microplastics, even nanoplastics with different approaches. So we have many, many approaches, some through satellites, aerial surveys, and so on. But I will not go in detail, we will discuss that later. But it's really a huge amount of methods that are available, each of them with some limits or advantages. And this is a point we have to discuss. What kind of approach is the most efficient for global, when it could be very, very efficient for local. And upscaling is a real problem. And this is the reason we need to probably shortlist the number of indicators that are available. Okay, from the GESAMP report, I took that slide. And this is, the most important part, I think, is to know exactly what we want to know. So where, what's about trends, about efficiency and measures and so on. So there are many reasons for monitoring marine litter. And then we have to know exactly where to go and to monitor and how to measure it. So at the different steps, we need, guidelines, we know some strategy and adequate tools. And this is not the case until now. So before we start on discussion later, I think that Alex will present the different types of indicators and how we can measure them. Please, Alex.
Sorry, I was with difficulties to turn on my mic here. Yes, we have here the next slide, please.
Yes.
Number 7. Yes, this is the GESAMP report 99, guidelines for the monitoring and an assessment of plastic litter in the ocean. And this was an attempt to put together the most updated information and strategies to produce information to understand what was going on in the sea in terms of marine litter. So we structured the report, and this was led by Peter Kershaw from GESAM. And we structured this report with three initial chapters setting the scene. So we talked about the background. We brought some definitions, including the size, definitions of microplastics, shape, and also the definitions related to how to mention, for example, primary and secondary microplastics. So we integrated the definitions that were out there in this document. And then we discussed it in chapter 3, very important aspects related to the strategies to monitor, like representativeness, the difficulties to match national realities. We discussed it we also discussed the important questions related to marine litter. And then we used the next chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 to present some methods used in the shoreline, seawater, seafloor, and biota. So these were the 4 compartments we discussed, we captured in the report. After that, we had a chapter on sample processing, which is a very important step in this way. And then sample characterization, as we will see, there are several aspects that we can characterize. And then in the chapter 10, we did some recommendations, and there is a table that I will present to you, so that we will capture perhaps in my opinion, the main aspect of this report, which is linking the information to the policy concerns a decision maker may have when dealing with marine litter. And then in chapter 11, we mentioned some future steps related mostly to technological development, governance, and new developments in terms of methods. So this is the report. It's available in the GESAM website. And then we discussed it, please, Francois, the next one. It was closely linked, all this exercise was closely linked to SDG 14.1.1. Sorry, it's in Portuguese here. And then we had a very important discussion on what would be out there in terms of methods, in terms of strategies to produce data. And then we discussed the tiers that were related to the indicators. So marine litter could be understood as tier 3. So no established patterns or standards internationally available. And then after this effort we did in GESAM and all the effort UNEP is doing, we intend to have marine litter coming to tier 2, which is indicator is conceptually clear and there are patterns or standards internationally available. This doesn't mean that the indicator will be available. This means tier 1. It would be tier 1, and we hope it will be available soon in the global scale. And then we realized that there was a need for additional sub-indicators other than density of floating plastic, which was the basic indicator linked to the SDG. And then, next one, please. We put in the report a synthesis of a discussion that was held in 2018 in IOC that started to discuss other potential sub-indicators related to, for example, here, to the sources. So we started to talk about river litter, the potential for plastic pollution, or even modeling. But we also mentioned sub-indicators related to the state, to the environment, to the compartments. So beach litter would be a very nice example that we captured. Next one, please. And then besides other compartments and other aspects, we also mentioned sub-indicators related to the impacts of marine litter, which also relates to the risks of marine litter. This is really important, and this is the focus of the most recent GISAP report, number 103, on the risk assessment. And then there are several aspects which are not trivial, which are not easy to measure here in this type of sub-indicator. Next one. And then in the discussions, we realized that a lot of things matter when we talk about risks, when we talk about impacts of marine litter. And then we need to evaluate the exposure, and size matters when we talk about exposure. And then we started to understand the complexity behind monitoring marine litter. So size matter. Next one. We realized that morphology also matter in terms of risk assessment. We also realized, the next one, that color also matter in terms of risks. And we also realized, the next one, that composition matters. So there are several other things that matter when we are talking about effects on impacts. Next one. So there are several aspects that matter, so that the situation can become too complicated in terms of guiding member states to produce information in terms of a global monitoring scheme. So that perhaps next one, we may conduct an exercise to perhaps keep it simple but informative. And here the Occam's razor helps us to think on that direction. Perhaps if we do not take, we do not consider properly why we are doing this, perhaps it may be too complicated that this will stuck us. So the question we need to answer here, in my opinion, is how can we have data worldwide forever? So if we start to produce indicators, it will be forever, and it should be or could be globally, so that we have a global picture of what's out there. So that's the challenge. And then we have some challenges here. Next one. One of these challenges is to, from this workshop and the SAPER report, we have to link what we are going to measure to why we are going to measure. So the why we are trying to do that. And then this is a very streamlined question that should be considered. I will come back to this issue in the next slide. Coming back to the thinker picture, this was drawn by Marcus Ericsson, and this brings us some kinds of questions that are very important, but these are not necessarily the questions that may come from policymakers, but this starts to bring us some light into this discussion. The next one is, in my opinion, one of the best interfaces of this report, because it links our variables, which we are calling indicators, to the policy concerns. So we have here shoreline SL, seafloor SF, biota, and SS is sea surface. And then we may have different subcompartments. We include the plastic size, and then we may have information that will feed into the policy concern tourism, so that people that are interested in having information of marine litter linked to tourism will look at these green cells, so that it directs the information to the user. So if you are worried or are interested in seafood safety, you may look at the biota. So that this table makes the example report very explicit to decision makers, so that they may decide which kind of indicator or variable is more appropriate to their needs. And there are several other challenges, as I will show you very briefly. Next one, please, Francois. There are lots of information that need to be improved related to trophic transference and accumulation of particles into the biota compartment, into the biota, so that we may really understand if there is or there is not bioaccumulation and biomagnification of particles, not of chemicals associated to particles. This is an important gap that will help us to understand risks in a better way, and then to select proper indicators to evaluate. Next one is related to what was already said, the technological development that's needed. So we may use satellites to look at microplastics in the future, hopefully, not only big litter items in the sea. Next one brings us the need to upscale the effects of marine litter, so that we may have indicators of higher levels of organization, like ecosystems, communities, or populations, so that we move from information from the individual, so stress proteins or other markers, to the ecosystem level, so that we may have this kind of information. This is extremely difficult to identify the direct link between marine litter and changes in the ecosystem, but it's a very important thing to look at. Almost in the end, we have another challenge that we are going to discuss tomorrow. Next one, please, Francois. We are going to discuss tomorrow in a specific session on citizen science. We need to understand a little bit better how we can engage society, not only as data providers, but in a broader way, considering lots of ethical aspects of citizen science that are not necessarily being considered up to date. In the end, next, we may have the idea or the importance to understand the risks and compare the risk perception with reality. So we need to produce this information, these indicators, and communicate clearly with the society without noise, without being so, I don't know how to say that in English. In Portuguese, it would be pyrotechnic, to be so passionate, okay? And the last one, the last challenge, I think this is the most important one, is to consider the global south. The global south means that we are talking about countries that may not have the political, the institutional, the financial capacity to produce data continuously. So we need to help the south becoming something like the north in terms of the capacity to conduct monitoring and to share the information. So there are several challenges, but we are in the correct way, I think, and then we need to be very conscious in selecting very basic indicators or variables that will be produced worldwide and forever. Thank you. Francois?
Okay, thank you, Alex. So I thank you to, having described all the different aspects of implementation and the different steps. What I will do now is to start in constraint and discuss more operationally the different indicators. So we have seen the different steps in terms of implementation. Yes, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, yes, Francois, clearly.
Okay.
There are some mics open here. We need to ask people to close their mics, please.
Okay, thank you. So we do know about the different steps, but we don't know so much about the different constraints. We do have different constraints that have to be considered when implementing global monitoring. Monitoring first, but also global monitoring then. Scientific constraints are quite important. So for instance, the site must be comparable and the approach must be comparable. And especially on the large scale, we must have a sufficient amount of literature, for instance, to make measurements more relevant. We have, we need to have some background scientific information that is accepted and recognized by the scientific community. So I underline in red on my table all those constraints that may be related to best practices. And this one on the background, scientific background, is one of these. Then we have to know exactly what kind of interference can be managed. For instance, for beach litter. For beach litter, we know about modeling and the stranding and so on, but in fact, there are some interferences such as the litter that is coming from land directly by tourism, beach goers and so on, and may not be linked to the pollution of the sea. So this is a kind of interference we must to manage and know. And for specific types of indicators, for instance, for ARM, we need to use sentinel species that are sensitive, where ARM is well understood, and diagnostic for pathogenicity is possible, and we must know about different interferences such as migrations and so on. So besides scientific constraints, we do have also methodological constraints. Protocols must be relevant, they have been referenced, tested, compared. We know exactly about the different phases in the measurements. The best example is use microplastics. And that was a comment in the previous session that we may use mussels, for instance. The problem of mussels, for instance, is that they are ingesting very small particles, and it's quite complicated to characterize them. So we know that there may be some biases there, and that's the reason why it has not been spread. This type of approach, when there is a very interesting potential in using existing mussel watch, and I'm sure that in the future it will be. But for now, we have to. Better manage these methodological constraints. Then we must know about conservation procedures and contamination and so on. And procedures also must be recognized. This is part of best practices, must be reproducible, representative also. And then standardization also can be reached when under regular monitoring. Environmental constraints also are important. It must be representative. This is exactly the same example as the beach. Beach litter is not only marine pollution, but also land pollution, sometimes mixed. Sometimes it's more one of the two types, and sometimes it's the other. And the results must enable, the categorization, according to the level of pollution. I will give an example on threshold later. And also, the results can support different types of objectives, like trends, amounts, for instance, but also efficiencies of reduction measures. Then logistical is quite important. It's quite complicated and very expensive to sample a very ultra deep sea, as an example. Also, opportunistic approach may be considered first when possible. And accessibility also is quite important for samples. And then we do have ethical constraints. So you see, most of all, sampling cannot be destructive for sure. It was stated in the previous session also. And even fishing, for instance, if you take samples after the trawling, it's in a way it's already descriptive, so it may be considered as a constraint. So beside the different constraints, then we try to, it's personal view, but it must be discussed. This is just to open the discussion. It's not a conclusive table, but I try to list all the different indicators that are, I would say, the most advanced when there are some that are not in, like satellite, for instance, is not in, modeling is not in, and may be discussed, but there will be some dedicated sessions, so that's the reason it's not in the table. For the more classical indicators, I listed a different approach, and then try to check whether it's we do have some I mean information on the states of monitoring, if it's upscalable or not, if it's we do have reference protocols, if we do have database harmonization, best practice, and so on. And at the end, to maybe use, I mean, shortlist all these indicators in a more restricted, to have something like more focus, I would say, and so that we could start on. So it's really open at this stage. It's not, this is just to open the discussion later. It's not to conclude on that. But I mean, we do have some arguments. If you look at beach, for instance, visual observation, it's really advanced in some countries. It's upscaling to global because we do have a lot of countries already monitoring. We do have reference protocols, including from UN. We do have database. Harmonization at the level of RSCs does exist. We do have basic best practices. Governance typically is under UNEP and UNEP regional sea conventions. So in that case, I think we can recommend to use and to upscale, I mean, to implement monitoring at a larger scale and coordinate it. So this is one example. As a counterpart, if you take, for instance, seafloor, I mean, in Europe, we did organize monitoring using fish stock assessment cruises by trawling. It works very well. It gives some reliable data, good trends, and will enable to analyze the efficiency of measures. But I mean, trawling is not existing in many countries, so it doesn't look like upscalable at a wider scale. And this is the reason why imagery, for instance, as proposed by Jamstead years ago, under implementation also in Europe actually, is probably a good alternative because I mean, it's an opportunistic approach using imagery either by diving or with ROV, for instance. It's then upscaled to global. If some countries don't have the means to, I mean, we do have scientific crews and step by step, year by years, we'll be able to cover different areas in the global ocean. And that's the reason why it's interesting. We do have reference protocols. We do have database, the one from Jamstead, the one from EMUNET, for instance. Harmonization is possible, I mean, chain protocols and so on. And I mean, we do have to implement best practices for that, but it could be also recommended a good approach. And then we have, I mean, some other, you see, midwater, for instance, there are some very important results that were launched recently about subsurface microplastics. We are not at the scale of monitoring. If you look at microplastics, for instance, floating, there is already some monitoring at different levels. What is interesting is that we have various initiatives from, I mean, under the G20 platform managed by Japan. Also the Five Giants database, who was, I mean, the origin of the published papers in 2014 by Marcus Eriksson, with more than 15,000 samples already stored in. And also in Europe, EMUNET did start on it. So the problem will not be on monitoring microplastics, understanding that it's just, I mean, part of the microplastics floating with a specific way to monitor, I mean, the tool. But the main question would be to harmonize the different database and to have the same units. So I think it's upscalable. It may be interesting. Again, it's not all microplastics. It's not the full set of information about that, but it could be a good proxy. And understanding if you go to smaller size microplastics, 10 microns, for instance, it will be more difficult because of contamination and many other types of fibers and so on that are natural. And there was a paper published some weeks ago by an Italian team, Stefano is there, I think, and showing that just 8% of the fibers was from polymer. So this is a problem when going down to small size microplastics. So an alternative could be using sediments. I think it's more conservative and could be a good one, but it's just starting, so it will need more time. And then about ARM, we discussed, I mean, there was a question also in the previous session with about interest of mussels. Again, it's because mussels, there is a potential there, but I mean, they are feeding on small filtrated fibers and must be characterized. It's still a problem technically, and that's the reason it has not been implemented so far. But there are some other approach that could be, for instance, I think personally that sea turtles are interesting because it's already monitored in different countries, Australia, Brazil, and Africa also there is some. Europe also, and the same for the same species. And so there is a way there to upscale this kind of approach, understanding that it will not go to all to the world ocean, but just intertropical areas. But at least it covers a large part of it, and it's quite interesting because it will, provide more information than just pressure or state indicators, having a new harm indicators. There is another type of indicator that has not been discussed so far, but was recommended at the last G7 meeting in France, Ministerial Research meeting. It's about inventory of rafted species. It's quite easy to maintain. It's not advanced at the moment. There is no database existing, but it's quite simple to record any species that has been found, fixed, settled on plastics. And it looks like after years and years, we may have a database like IUCN is managing a list on endangered species. It would be quite easy to have information about the number of new species that are found in plastics and new locations and so on. And in terms of monitoring, it's an original approach, but could be, I think, very, very interesting. So as you see, we will discuss that, and that will take probably weeks and months before there is an agreement on that. But the idea would be to probably to shortlist the different indicators before starting on, more in-depth evaluation. So the question is that both monitoring and best practices are formal processes. It's not just saying, okay, we must do that, and but each step is very important, and each step needs some well-defined processes, and these different steps will relate to the strategy. Where to go. That was exactly the presentation from Alex. The protocols, so we need some guidance, manuals, references, and so on. Harmonization is important. Quality insurance is also. Data management is one of the main parts that has to be organized. And then this is quite important when we consider monitoring. It's not just having data, but also we have to compare the data with baseline and thresholds. So this is an important process that is often not considered when monitoring. And so I think we have to discuss this part because it's part of practices, and it will probably lead all operators to more sophisticated, more constrained measurements of the different indicators. And then at the end, there will be the problem of targets. Shall we set targets where to go? And for that, baseline and threshold will be necessary. Then we come to the management, and for that, the data for monitoring will be more than important. They will be essentials. So I have three different examples that I think they may, explain what is important in the process. The first one is the Coordinated Environmental Monitoring Program from OSPA, that is UN-related. It's not a UN Regional Sea Convention, but it's linked to UNEP process, Regional Sea Convention processes. And they develop quality insurance, what they call Coordinated Environmental Monitoring Program, CEMP. These are documents that are describing all the steps for an indicator. So this is an example, the one for a litter ingested by sea turtles. And you see, this is just a table. In fact, there is a full document describing all these cells. So the monitoring purpose is described, the monitoring guidelines, where they are from, the reference and so on, how the quality insurance procedures are in place or not, quality control, and quality check, the data and so on. So all steps of the monitoring are described precisely, and all parties involved and that are listed. You see contracting parties, for instance, in charge of monitoring. Here they are. They must also check at each step. So this is a guideline document to be sure that best practices are in place. And it's quite important because it controls very well the process of monitoring and cross-control. So the second example I think is quite important, is about baselines. Monitoring means we do a baseline where we are starting from, at least to see whether amounts are increasing or decreasing, but also to see whether a measure has been efficient or not. So this is an example of a baseline for beach litter. This is European Commission process, MSFD, and with all, member states with coastlines that have been involved. And so, information from thousands of beaches, I don't remember, I think it's something like 540 beaches have been monitored for many years. And then, so we start in 2017 to collect the data. Then, we completed the process of defining the methodology and so on, the quality check. And then, we analyze, we selected the best data. And in fact, we took all the data from 2015, 2016, and then we drafted data first. And before we came to the baseline, and we are able now to describe either by country. So green, for instance, are for single-use plastic, blue are for fishing gear, and violet, deep violet are for all types of litter. So we may set a baseline for each type of litter or by each category, like single-use plastics. This is to monitor, you understand, this is to monitor the efficiency of measure in the ban of single-use plastic, for instance. And these baselines are quite important because they're also enable to define the threshold. And thresholds are, the value indicating that we are in a good situation, we have reached the good environmental status, what we call the good environmental status or not. So how to define the thresholds? There are many different options. Zero option, we say, no litter is the best possible value, but it's impossible to reach. Even in the Arctic, you will find some plastics. Value of no return, cutoff value, for instance, and each of them have may fit with some indicators, and we have different concepts. Precautionary principle, for instance, for harm. And you can see that it's quite complicated to choose one that is adapted for all. It's impossible, and then we have to select the best one for each of the indicators. So I think it's a necessary step before we define a threshold. So we did start on that 2 years ago. So requirements are well understood. We need to have a data based on comparable beach litter monitoring data. Robust, the threshold value must be robust. What is interesting to know, to understand is that it is the same everywhere. So, if it's good in Europe, normally it's good in Brazil, it's good in Africa, it's good in Australia. In terms of impact, true impact, it's not just aesthetic and so on, but in terms of impact, normally the same value must be everywhere. And then assessment also must be robust. And then we have some monitoring constraint and so on. So within MSFD, we did analyze, more than 3,000 samples, and then we selected just for some years, 2015, 2016, and then we calculated, the value for, the procedure we chose was defining percentiles. 1%, 5%, 10% of the baseline value. So there is a part of expert judgment, and the reason is that it's really difficult on a beach to know exactly what is good or not, because you have various types of impact: aesthetic, environmental, injuries, health, and so on. And merging all of them is impossible. You cannot have just one value, and this is the reason we decide to work on percentiles. And at the end, we define Q15 as the value. So this is interesting because this threshold has been voted by the member states in Europe, and they all agreed on that. There was no vote against. And so this week there was a press release. It was launched the first threshold value for European marine litter monitoring. And what is important then is that this value will be transposed in the national laws and will be enshrined in the national laws, and may become then constraining and so on. So it's quite important because the whole process of monitoring is not just only defining one indicator, but then implementing it, monitoring it, but also all associated information such as baseline, thresholds are quite important for further management. So you can see, for instance, the results from in Europe. And what is interesting, so the value is 20 items per 100 meters. and there is just only a few that are there. You see just one. All areas in Europe are above, and we understand that. I mean, it will take many years before we reach that good environmental status. And actually, we are.
Is your other chargers plugged?
I'm sorry. Sorry.
Hi, Francois. I think it's an open mic here.
Yeah,
It's okay.
please carry on. I think it was an unintended.
Okay. Okay, and so you can see that all of beaches above the level, so it will take many years before we reach the good environmental stages. And so we decided, we decided to start discussion on intermediate targets to reach that, because it could be a problem if the law asks any countries to reach one threshold that is unreachable. So just, some ideas of, we have to discuss these and will be refined. Arthur will help for that. And, but some recommendation I think would come from, could be an output from the discussion this afternoon, could be a possible shortlisting of the most relevant indicators. So the list here is not the right one, but it's just a proposed one. Then elaborate formal guideline for global marine litter indicators. Then recommend and support research method. I understand that modeling is quite important. It's already in the process of global monitoring. Drones also, for instance, satellites must be in also for sure. And then elaborate best practices dedicated documents. Something like describing in detail for each of the selected indicators how to implement it correctly, so that each party, countries, institutions, and so on will be able to follow exactly the same. And this is an important conclusion from the meeting. And then what will be important probably is also consider technical workshop to harmonize the approaches and protocol. The example for floating microplastics between the Japanese initiative and European one, and 5 jars database and so on, to harmonize all the, in terms of units also are quite important. Okay, I thank you very much. I just would like to open the discussion now. It's really, I will be happy to make it very informal so that we can really go in deep and extract the most interesting information from that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Francois. I saw some raised hands among the participants. I think from René from Sanae. That was correct. Would you like to ask some questions?
Oh, no. I was not raising my hand. I just put an upload sign.
Same to me. I just try to how does it work?
It's a Japanese-French connection, We are
Yes.
But fantastic presentation. Thank you. Just a question, because I was a bit confused at one point when you were talking about threshold. You mean it's a European way of saying that there is a level above or below which there is some kind of recommendation not to go above or below. It depends which way, of course, the is made.
The threshold is a scientific value. It means we must determine what is good or what is not good, and at what level we are above the value, indicating we are in the bad parts, we are not good in terms of levels of litter. The problem is that normally there is dose response relationship, and when the litter increase, the impact increase. And the problem is that for the different indicators, we do have this, for the same indicator, we may have different types of impacts. So we cannot define one threshold value just based on the impact of one of the impact of the indicator. You understand, for instance, microplastic in fish may be transferred along the trophic chain in some cases, and maybe carrying some chemicals. And so the two types of impact will have two different thresholds. But in terms of monitoring and regulation, we must have just one. And so we have to merge that. And that's the reason why it's quite complicated to define the way to define the threshold. It's not just, the type of impact, because there are many impacts. And so when we agreed on the method, then we define it, and it means that this is what is good. And then when we know exactly, I mean, this is exactly like the cholesterol in the blood, you see, you know exactly the level where it's a norm, in fact. And if you are above the norm,
it's a norm, yeah.
Good, yeah. And then from the threshold, you can derive targets. I mean, the states or the UNEP or Regional Sea Convention may define targets saying all the parties must go as this level that will be above or not. And the problem we have is that normally it must be under the norm, so that is good, but it's so because it may take a long time, I mean decades to reach, we may define some intermediate targets. So for instance, for beach, it's 20, for Europe, it's 20 items per 100 meters, but we know that it will not be reached before, 50 years for some beaches. So we may have some targets that are 30 or 40 to see.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It means that some of these thresholds can be weighted. Some can have a weight on them that you can move, so that making things a bit more complicated.
Yes. But normally, this is where we must go. But we know that it's complicated. And then we have to adjust policies and management measures and so on, so that we can reach. And when we'll have reached, we think that it will be correct. We will be in the correct situation.
Yeah, this is just a comment. This is really important because we need to build this monitoring process on the basis on the capacities of the on the capacities of the member states.
No, it's not the case, Alex.
Sorry?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's when it's good anywhere.
No.
But the measures, you cannot reach them, yes.
Yes, I'm not talking about the threshold. I'm talking about the capacity and the targets in terms of reaching that. You are correct, but perhaps some countries will not get to 20 items even in 100 years. So they need to decide what's feasible, and then we may leave some kind of flexibility so that they can move in this direction and not stuck. But you are right. Threshold is a threshold. Thank you.
So I have a question. If Francois, if you could go back to the last slide of your presentation, or the last but one.
This one?
Yeah, with the possible short listing of the most relevant indicators. So I was wondering to what extent, when producing such a list, you would weigh sort of the impact of getting data from certain methods or certain compartments versus their feasibility. So for instance, if feasibility of getting beach leader data is the highest, does it also correspond with the impact? And maybe when, thinking about sort of identifying which elements we want to increase the readiness level of, would you identify some that are, let's say at the moment, low on feasibility because of the cost or availability of technology or something, but which would really have the highest impact in terms of addressing knowledge gaps or so on?
Yes, as you see on the table, you have information about the state of if we are advanced or not, if it's upscalable. I explained that trawling, for instance, is quite interesting because the sampling scheme is really, at least in Europe, is really good. Stratified sampling, so it's good, but you cannot scale it because many countries don't have trawling, you see, and will not join. When if you use, for instance, diving imagery through diving or ROV, you have a lot of countries that may implement survey by diving in marine protected areas, for instance. It's quite simple. And also ROVs for deep sea, such as Jamstec or some institutions are doing. And you may merge all this together and you may cover the world ocean more easily than by trawling. So technically it's probably more advanced by trawling, but when you consider global scale, I think it's a problem to upscale that, and you cannot, ask the countries to go in that direction because most of them will not accept.
So if I could follow up, so let's stick to the example of the seafloor, trolling versus imagery. And now you had I think it's on slide 30 with the, yeah, so the next slide.
Which one?
Slide 30.
So,
yes. Yeah, so the formal process. So let's say if you wanted to identify the bottleneck, or at which point sort of is, where's the weakness? Where's the point that you need to invest most resources to make sure that the data or the information does not get stuck? So
I think that will be, this is implementation of the protocol from the start.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, from the start, I mean, scientific references and so on, there would not be any data if you choose, I mean, monitoring by trolling.
Yeah, so for that particular approach, we are at that level of the whole process.
Exactly.
Okay.
And for some other will be, I mean, then probably, you see. And so, for instance, if you go for microplastics in muscle, you are already the monitoring network. Muscle Watch is in many, many countries, so you can implement it worldwide. You can sample easily. I mean, it's not a problem to kill some mussels to assess microplastics. I mean, you can eat them if you want. And the problem is that it's more with the protocol that will not assess, I mean, properly the very small particles, unless it's very expensive approach, and also you may be affected by contamination, this kind of things, you see. So it's more a question of updating the protocol, but when it's ready, be ready for that. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I see a question in the chat from Carla. Getting back to Heidi's question of what indicators would be of use. Considering what has been presented, maybe it is best to first ask, what do we want to inform? Risks to policy concerns, diagnosing the state of pollution potential sources with our indicators.
All end users. Maybe Alex will
Yes, this is really important because it will make national or subnational monitoring schemes more sustainable in terms of money, in terms of infrastructure, so that if it's linked to policy concerns, we may perhaps guarantee that it will be more linked to the things that worry or the concerns of a country or for a state. And that's what we are doing, Carla. We are working together here in Brazil, and trying to decide this type of things. And when we get closer to the policy concerns, things get clearer in the mind of policymakers, and then we can argument and secure funds and people and infrastructure to keep going. Of course, this should be linked to the other issues like SDGs, and then this is a not easy task, so that we try to arrange all things to produce data locally and feed data globally. So, but it's a wicked task to accomplish.
Heidi, would you like to respond to that as well?
Yes, no, I was just thinking like how to move forward, for example, with what we already have. So report 99 of GESAM, that outlines, is when we worked on that, when GESAM worked on that, then there is excellent guidance, I think, in the, I think it's section 10, that outlines key or some common policy concerns that are related to marine litter microplastics, and then what monitoring approaches could be taken to find the information to properly inform action on them. So I think that there are some policy aspects already outlined in that one. Then I think that the GESAM report 103 on the risk assessment part, so taking those two and looking a bit at then how do you avoid things, how do you measure risk also? I think it's a key consideration when you're looking at policy concerns. So you have policy concerns, how do you manage risk associated with them, whether that's an increase in litter on beaches which affect tourism or fisheries and so on. And then going from there, look at what's existing with the SDGs. So we have what's in the environment, we have percent of mismanaged plastic waste or managed plastic waste, for example, or waste in 11.6, I think it's then, but there isn't much connecting them. So I think there is an opportunity there to identify where are there interconnecting indicators that still support and are built within the framework of the SDGs. Thanks.
I think I would like to say that, I mean, one of the questions would be to aggregate the results together. So we have different indicators, different thresholds, different levels, and for each indicator, different levels for which there will be a different interpretation. And then aggregating all together will probably help to support and to see whether it's good or not. But I mean, it's a complex task to, I mean, put all the indicators together because there is no metrics for that actually.
May I? It's interesting that here we are doing an exercise here in Brazil, trying to link all these things that Heidi mentioned and Francois too, in terms of joining the exposure aspect, the sources, the exposure, and the effects. It's not an easy task, especially because there are some indicators or variables that are almost impossible to produce in logical aspects. So we need sometimes to identify how much of the how can I say that people avoiding going to a beach, how much of that people are avoiding to go to that beach because of litter. So we need to establish a cause effect related to litter. In some aspects, the way to produce this data is based on interviews. So it's not, the method itself is not so easy, but in terms of creating a strategy to monitor marine litter, we need to consider these three big boxes, like the sources, like the exposure, and the effects. Although the effects are hard to measure and to assign directly to marine litter, but we need to consider that.
There's a question in the chat from Amy. Maybe would you like to just speak up or?
Yes, sorry, I'll just unmute myself. I think it was more of I was reflecting on the questions that were coming across from the different speakers, and that it seems like a complex nature of what questions policymakers want us to answer, the questions scientists like to answer, and then the questions of how do we prioritize and bring them together. So we are having a similar discussion as Alex mentioned in Brazil. We're doing that here in Norway, and we're finding it incredibly challenging for our policymakers, for example, in the environment agencies, to say what they want us to monitor and why they want us to monitor. I can just randomly pull something out of the air, like if they say, oh, we want to understand how much plastics there are in the ocean, and say, okay, but why? If you can tell us why, then we know what specific matrix or indices we can use. And that kind of gap here, they can't seem to join it together, and we're struggling to join the science to the policy because they don't know what they want to ask. Are they looking for an effect? Are they looking for what's the exposure? Or are they looking for sources? They're really not sure what's the best option or what they want to do. And I think they're also looking from a more international or global perspective so that they can then align what's going on in Norway to globally, but we feel that, well, at least we're seeing that there's a definite mismatch, and the way forward is really hard because it's just a question and answer going around in circles rather than us being able to put our hand up and say, no, this is exactly what you're trying to do and this is why you want to do it. I don't know if that makes much sense, but it seems just to be a very complex situation. And I know it doesn't happen just in where we are, but we're noticing it in other countries as well. So it's really important to have like an international kind of consolidated effort to be able to do so. I think that's what I was trying to say.
Hi, Amy. Your mention, what you said is very interesting, because even here in Brazil, we are creating a process, a learning process, together with decision makers and stakeholders as a whole. We are engaging NGOs, private sector, and other sectors, so that we are trying to level or to put everybody at the same page. So they are now at the same page, and now we are starting to understand what are the potential, what's the size of what fits the size of our legs in terms of money, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of human capital, so that we will figure out the state, not we, the state, we will figure out what they will start to do, if they will. So it's really complicated, because we may figure out that there's no money, and then there's no litter data to be shared in the next years. That's really important, but we need to do it together, so that science will support policy decisions, not guide necessarily, not say what they are going to do. Yeah, it's complicated, but we have several processes ongoing, so that in the next future, in the next years, I think we will have the opportunity to have this data being produced in the local level to feed the global level. Just to ask, how are we in terms of time, Arthur?
I think we are 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes from the pause.
Yes. So we have, yeah, just like Francois said. So I see some comments directly to that topic in the chat from Carla and Richard. I think it's okay. Maybe if you'd like to speak up, that's fine. Otherwise, I can read them.
Hi, Arthur. So thank you. I'll just speak quickly here. I think this links very well to what was discussed in the plenary on Friday about improving our science communication. So this is a matter of us maybe better communicating what marine litter as a science is, so that our policymakers are more informed, so that they know what questions to ask, as Amy put it, because this is a very important aspect. It's not as easy as it sounds. And they may ask the simple question of how much plastic is there? And that sounds easy enough, but it involves a whole lot of different indicators and different variables. And why do you want to know how much plastic is there? And do you want to know where it comes from, where it's going, what size it is? So it's all different types of aspects to consider. And I'm wondering if this is something that we can better improve with science communication and ocean literacy, also directed to policymakers and decision makers in general.
Thank you, Carla. I think the problem is that science is complex. Huh?
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
I actually slightly disagree with that point, that it's complex. I think the questions that we're trying to ask now are really simple and very basic, and which Amy's already referred to, and Carla as well. That how much is there? How did it get there? What's the size distribution? And then what harm does it do at the concentrations that we find it? I think these are conceptually very simple questions, difficult to do, but I don't actually think the science is very hard. It just needs the funding to enable us to make the correct observations. But at the moment, it seems very difficult to get that funding.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it has become a global environmental problem, and I think this is better and better supported. And so there is now a lot of science. You know, I've been starting in 1992. I was alone for about 20 years in my country, and now we are at least 40, 45, 50 laboratories working on that, and it's really well supported. So we have more and more information. But you see, for instance, if you look at modeling and amounts of litter, most of the papers that are published on modeling show that there is a large, expected increase in the coming years. But in fact, 80% of the published papers, they show that, the amounts are remaining constant. So it's not really solved at the moment. For sure, there is an increase, and probably some areas are more affected than the other. But it's not clear how it increases. And so this is a problem. Before we go to policymakers, so the message must be simple, and when the understanding is something complicated, if not complex.
I would say it depends also on some countries. In France, for instance, we've been asked, we, meaning some people working on this problem, and Christophe Maes, by the way, was also is part of this discussion, and he was also on the panel. We were asked by the level of the state, let's say the parliament, the PM, the parliamentary members, or the parliament members, they form a committee, and the committee just from a senator and what we call in France a député. They asked our panel, okay, can you explain to have the complete idea of what is the problem with plastics? They had an idea, but they wanted to have the perspective of the, let's say, scientists working in the field. So in order to make their own idea, and then from this committee push, which is then politics, but push in order to either ask for a project or program to be set or to connect with what is done at the European level. François also, I think, was asked to present something. So that's what we do also at the European level. There are some expert groups, and then they propose a program, and the program, that's a place where the money could come or could be given. But
yeah, I would like to add probably also that it's very strange because plastic pollution. The consideration from policymakers is because of the social demand. If you go on the beach and it's dirty, the policymaker will act. And if you, come with some, images from the deep where the, litter is accumulated, they will act. And what is strange is that when you see climate change and so on, it took a long time without any, measures taken already. When for more litter, at least in Europe, but many countries also outside of Europe. The resolution from UNEA last year was a good example. It has been very fast, and single-use plastic. So we cannot see the difference now because it's these measures are really recent. But policymakers, they did a lot. My feeling is that they did a lot in the recent years.
They need a lot of what, François? I didn't catch.
They have taken a lot of measures, to reduce.
Actions.
Yeah, actions, reduction measures.
So
I raised my hand. Could I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with François. What I think is not happening so much, I think there's a lot of action happening, but a lot of action is very kind of reactive sometimes. It's not necessarily looking at monitoring data and information, but rather going for, okay, plastic single-use bags. Yes, that's what we're going to do. And then there isn't really any way even of monitoring whether that was the biggest problem in the country or not. So we're trying to support kind of a national source inventory approach where we combine both workshops with stakeholders, but also baseline, like simple, initial, short, quick snapshot baseline setting in countries. So we have one ongoing in Kenya and Seychelles, and I think we'll speak more about that later during the week. Thank you.
I think from my side, I think that I mean the only way to organize globally on regular basis would be probably through United Nations Regional Sea Conventions. I mean, we may have some initiative like the one from JAMSTEC, for instance, that will be supported and implemented in other countries and so on. But because it's an opportunistic approach using, I mean, specific means and so on, and the data will come in the global ocean, but step by step, but on regular basis and funded and so on, that from the states, I think that would be just only because regional sea conventions have already the agreements, and also they started with regional action plan and monitoring. So this is a very good, and when you compare, I mean, it was discussed last year at the Oceanos meeting, when you compare with other initiatives, I mean, the ocean data and so on, it's really nice to have a demand coming from countries and even from policymakers to have some data. So it's quite important for monitor, and it's a good argument, I say.
Yeah, may I add two aspects of governance related to this issue. One is that there are some places that they are not linked to regional seas program, like the southwestern Atlantic. There is no regional seas here. And the other aspect, within the national level, we may face some nations, some member states that do not have policies or regarding marine litter, or if they have, they are not pushing it. This is the case here in Brazil, so that the states, we are a federation, the states are taking the lead, so that the discussion is being conducted at least in 2 of the 17 coastal states here, so that this kind of national guidance that René mentioned in France, we are not having this coordination, this kind of coordination is not being in place in some countries like here in Brazil.
We have a raised hand from Venkatesan.
Yeah, it was a nice talk. I have a doubt with you. We know very well this plastic menace has gone from coast to the deep ocean. The deepest ocean in the world has got plastic now. And most of the policy makers are very keen, and this is the most sensitive issue among all the pollutants presently we have, because this is seen visibly. One of the presentation where we could see was the large amount of fishing nets which is taken into the sea by fishing trawlers and the bigger vessel. I was told in one of the NGO study, 40% of them are not brought back to the shore back. So these nets are left, and they become a sort of microfiber. Some of them are in the water column ever. So this is a bit sensitive issue in the fisheries angle also. The moment you declare that this particular place in the ocean is having more plastic, then the fishing industry would be affected. So I'm putting both the questions. One is, how do we take FAO into the picture? Another way, how do you safeguard the fishing industry by declaring a portion with this data to say that, yes, this data shows that there's large amount of plastic debris in this water. Thank you.
So I think, François speaking, I think that we do have already some measures. I mean, the mission in Europe is as proposed to tag any fishing gear, large, I would say, nets and so on, to facilitate the recovery. And I think it has been taken already, this kind of measures in some other countries until now. I know that the company launched a system that is not so expensive, in the range of $100, and to tag a net, and it's maybe, I mean, interesting because the price of a net is quite elevated. And so there is a way to manage this kind of problem, and also understanding where they are going and recovery in some cases. There is a private company in Europe that are making money with recovering and recycling, I mean, fishing nets, and they are organizing, they have organized a collection camp, and it works very well. So we may have some way to manage also this kind of problem. In any case, I mean, deep sea litter is, remember, is always more than 95% of the litter.
I would like to add something. That the question of Venkatesan was also about the fact that fishermen, for instance, in the end, and the end is not very far for them, will lose money because the plastics and the gears and the nets and so on will hamper them. This is a very logical argument, but at the level of states, this is not logical. What you can lose in 3 years from now is not an argument to say that you stop to do it now, this year, because this year you make a profit. I mean, it's, and that's not the only example. I mean, climate change is a real one, but so yes, we all know that in whatever number of years from now, we have started, but we will have a problem at a higher level and losing money because of that, but doesn't change the way the policies are made so far.
May I? I think we are almost in the end of the session,
yeah.
But I, considering the talk of Sana Ishiba in the last session, I think it would be perhaps interesting or important to discuss the difference between AUVs and indicators in terms of marine litter, because when we talk about beach litter, are we talking about an AOV, an essential ocean variable, or are we talking about an indicator? Perhaps we could discuss it a little bit more and be at the same page so that we can move forward in the understanding what we are talking about. Formally, I mean, based on Sanai brought to us.
So if I could respond quickly to that, Alex, marine pollution or marine plastic litter is not yet an essential ocean variable, right? It's a proposed concept, and it's seen as a way of maybe complementing the SDG indicator framework. So if there are important variables that need to be measured to address, for example, some of the scientific questions or to respond to the needs of the policymakers, which are not part of the SDG framework. Say all the ones related to biota. I've seen a lot of focus on biota, right, in your presentation and in the GASAMP report. For aspects, for reasons of feasibility, this is not considered in the SDG framework, but this is something that we could maybe list as one of the priority variables under the essential ocean variable framework, if this can be actually subject to some coordinated observing efforts, right? So this would be sort of my perspective on the difference between the two. They should be complementary, and it's fine to have an overlap if there are different methods and different platforms that can, for example, contribute. Let's say if we take the global one on the distribution of floating macroplastics, if that can be, let's say, measured from ships of opportunity in the open ocean, and that can contribute to better informing the models used for that particular indicator in the SDG framework, then I think that's an example of how the EOV approach can complement the existing SDG framework. I'm regarding the beach leader, you know, this is, at least in the case of goose, this is sort of a bit beyond our current scope of activities to going into the inshore dimension. But again, for Sanaya might have a different perspective on that.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, and then I agree, totally agree with Arthur. And so when thinking about what goose community can do is probably development of the global observing system of the marine litter in offshore or not beach, and maybe coastal, but a more offshore and global ocean. And also, what I want to say I want to say is normally the development of the identifying and the development of EOBs, the goose EOBs, takes long time, and then it needs a the very extensive discussion and examination needed. But in terms of the marine debris, there are already there lots of efforts have been done. For example, like GESAMP has done the great job, and it's already the harmonization of the methodology as identified, and also the recommended. There are lots of recommendations, and it's summarized in the report, and also readiness level of feasibility and the readiness level of each monitoring method is already done. I mean, not done, maybe, but the progress. So that is great advantage. So using this already existing resources, the goose community can develop the EOB, and that probably goose community can start coordinating the existing monitoring project, coordinating the existing monitoring project, or maybe the data depository project to working together. So we have to hurry up because society and the policy waiting. But and at the same time we have a great background, already great background. So we have to, I mean, the goose community, the GESAM community, and UNEP community have to work closely and in a collaborative way. So I think there is a good, very good opportunity.
Can I make a quick point?
Yes,
yes, please, Richard. Yes.
Right. So first thing is, I was really sorry to miss the first part of Francois' talk. I had a catastrophic internet failure here. So you've possibly covered this already, but I just wanted to make two quick points. And one is that, and really, I'm sorry if you've already made these, but the first is that I think we've got to make sure that we move towards mass of material as well as number. And in the past, it's been where there's been great work, but it has focused so much on numerical abundance. And I think in order to make the mass balances correctly, we have to deal with mass, which is one thing that my colleague and I did in a Nature Comms paper a few weeks ago. We made sure we converted everything to mass. The second point is that we have to be very careful about our lower size boundary. And I'm sure, Francois, you covered this, but this idea that everything less than 5 millimeters is microplastic really doesn't go that extra mile, which I think we have to do now in order to understand this, what is happening to this material. We want to get size distributions, but we must define our lower size boundary, particularly if we're talking about abundance, because it just doesn't really make sense to talk about abundance of a material less than 5 millimeters. I mean, I have some, I don't think we should be using 5 millimeters actually, because it doesn't follow the SI units, et cetera, but that's a different issue. But let's make sure we move towards mass.
I think we have some historical reasons for the choice of the size and on boundaries and so on, but yeah.
Absolutely, historical reasons, and I think they're the wrong ones, but we should be following SI units, and that means...
Yes, but you know, I mean, in terms of, I mean, opposition between numbers and weights, in fact, it depends on the what you're considering. For instance, if you're considering the amounts of chemicals that are bringing by plastic, then the weight will be far more important, because this is the amount of plastics that will give the amount of pollutants, chemicals. But if you try to understand, I mean, the risk with a rafted species, I mean, the number of pathogen bacteria and so on that are rafted across the oceans, then this is a number. For instance, in the Mediterranean Sea, we do have 250 billion particles, each of them able to raft different species everywhere. And in terms of amount, that will be just in the range of 1,000 tons. And this is the same for the garbage, patches that we have in the oceans. In terms of weight, it's just thousands of tons only, when in terms of amounts, it's, I mean, huge amounts. So, I mean, so you see where the difference is. And we must consider also numbers in some cases, more than weights. And also the problem is that when you're trotting on the seafloor, if you have one container, then it will, I mean, the total amount will be far above, and when in fact it's the number of single-use plastic that is important, see? So it depends on what you want to know, and this is the reason why most of the monitoring is based on number until now. One container only is 20 tons, but I mean, it's thousands of pieces, and each of them are differently counted.
Yes, I absolutely not saying we shouldn't use number, but we've got to make sure we set that bottom boundary, because clearly one particle of 100 microns, if it breaks into 1,000 particles, we end up with 1,000 particles, but they're much smaller. So it's bigger surface area. Absolutely.
Yes.
We must do both. I think we've got to go that extra mile now.
Yeah, you're right. By chance, nobody is able to count the nanoparticles until now.
Technically, very difficult problems. Yes,
Exactly.
Absolutely agree.